Hi, and welcome to the first installment of our lecture series on civil rights. It is actually Unit 7, not Unit, I think, 12, as I accidentally wrote on your on the PDF you have. I won't just be kind of reading all the words on the slides because you can already do that. You've already got the PDF. But I will be pointing out things that maybe need more explanation or that have kind of a side story that could be useful. So you guys already know about the end of Reconstruction. It is usually considered to be Reconstruction is kind of over in 1877 after the corrupt bargain, as it was called, between the white North, which basically wanted a Republican president, and the white South, which wanted federal troops out of the South and into any kind of federal enforcement of civil rights laws. And this returned the South to a system of, So, you already know about Plessy v. Ferguson. You know Jim Crow, as stated. Apparently a character from a blackface show from the time of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is basically a continuation of the Black Codes that we've also talked about in a previous unit on Reconstruction, but it is different. Don't call the system of law, especially in the South, but not only really, during this time period, the Black Codes, because now it is Jim Crow. You already know about Plessy v. Ferguson, and definitely seen as one of the Supreme Court's worst decisions. In this unit, I've included some pictures that are really kind of grisly, but I do think it's important for us to understand the reality of the situation, not only in the South, but especially in the South, during this time period. Lynchings were seen as kind of great communal celebrations almost by the people committing them. And it kind of boggles the mind that this is the kind of thing that you would bring your kids to and get dressed up in your best clothes and kind of pose for the camera. But that's kind of the reality of the Jim Crow South during this time period. It's elsewhere on the slide. It's important to keep in mind the difference between de jure segregation and de facto segregation. Their de facto segregation is definitely not limited to the South. It's in a lot of ways nationwide. Sometimes it's enforced by the KKK, which went through, I think a lot of people say there were three kind of main waves of KKK violence and popularity, and the second one was the 1920s. Watch Black Klansman for a look at the kind of end of the third wave of the KKK. One thing that comes to mind that could be useful as a CAS project is helping an institute that's trying to find and document and memorialize the lynchings that took place between the end of Reconstruction and in South Carolina, in any case, 1947 was apparently the final or the most recent racial lynching in the state. Overall, it looks like there were at least 164 race-based lynchings in South Carolina during this time period, and I'll include a link to this institute. So if you are interested in doing a CAS project that would be really, I think, good for South Carolina, you could be a volunteer for them. Something worth looking at. In this unit, we're mostly going to talk about the post-World War II leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, but there are some important people we should know, at least for background. Washington and Du Bois, you already know. Marcus Garvey, maybe not, because he's going to end up probably being most effective as an inspiration for other leaders later on, especially Malcolm X. And A. Philip Randolph we'll run into a little bit after the war. He lives for a good while, and he takes a more kind of economic approach to civil rights. All right, so you had the Great Migration, the kind of time limits on that are kind of mixed depending on who's counting. Where millions of African Americans moved north. Patterns of migration tended to be kind of consistent. So, for instance, South Carolina ends up with a kind of a large movement of South Carolina blacks to Baltimore and D.C., at least according to this map, and to some extent New York. You guys have surely studied the Harlem Renaissance and maybe elsewhere. It was a kind of cross genre kind of flowering, involving music, involving writers, visual artists, and so on. But it kind of fizzles in a lot of ways with the economic downturn of the 1930s. Other important things, World War II. Please run any questions you have on it by me. Other important developments during World War II are the Tuskegee Airmen. I really recommend the movie Red Tails, which I'll put a link to to the trailer of. And Tuskegee, known kind of by normal adults for not just the airmen, but also kind of mirror side, one of the dark sides of racial injustice, even on into the 1970s, was the Tuskegee Institute syphilis experiment, which basically allowed hundreds of black men to live with syphilis without being told what they had, pass it on to their wives, who could then pass it on to their children. And even though it was entirely treatable, a lot of lives were ruined by this. And I guess the idea by the doctors who ran the program was that it was a good idea to find out what happened to people with syphilis when you didn't treat it. So that's one of the great kind of moral shames, I guess, of this time period that a lot of people think about. Let's see. In some ways, the results of fighting in World War II on the African American community was kind of similar to that as in World War I, and in that it spurred developments on the civil rights, leading us to Truman. Truman does try to make some legislative progress on civil rights, but the Senate especially is just not having any of it. And you know what presidents tend to do when Congress is not doing what they hope. They take action through executive orders. So this, the ending of segregation in the Army, was a hugely important executive order, even if it does take kind of several years to really be carried out fully. The Cold War, as you can see, had a kind of mixed effect on the civil rights movement, partly because as you can see, some people thought that that was all the more reason to deal with our problems at home, and some people, kind of most famously Joe McCarthy, but not only, thought that the Cold War was was a time for no criticism of American policies, and so that kind of tied up with the Red Scare is going to be pressure put on civil rights leaders and the civil rights movement as kind of part of an attack on communism. And in the 1950s, you had a kind of calm before the storm of the civil rights movement really starting to take shape under the Eisenhower administration. Some of these developments are technological in nature. TVs and cars kind of bring Americans, black and white, north, south, west, into into each other's lives in ways maybe that they hadn't been before. So this is going to be important. And you also had kind of a somewhat off the radar development of a lot of the networks that are going to be huge within the black community in the coming decades of the civil rights movement. And we'll get to that in a lot more detail in the future.